evening, and welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. We're continuing our series looking at the poetic book in the Old Testament, Lamentations. And so far we've looked at the first two acrostic poems that come to us there in Lamentations. And the acrostic, in this case, is, for most of the Old Testament, it's each a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So each line begins with a different letter and works its way down. So the first two chapters in Lamentations are each 22 verses long, corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So it begins with, the first line begins with Aleph, then Beit, Gimel, all the way down through the alphabet. Chapter 3 is also an acrostic, but it's slightly different. So it actually functions three lines in a row. So the first three begin with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Then the second three lines begin with the second letter, all the way down through, again, the alphabet. So 66 divided in 3 equals 22. And again, it's hard for our English translations to really capture that. We would kind of be forcing ourselves into a bit of a linguistic box to try and match the acrostic. So we just don't try, but we need to know it's there because it is helpful for kind of remembering the poetic nature of these things. One of the other things about this chapter is it has quite a famous verse, or at least a phrase of a verse that then has made its way into kind of our everyday biblical language and the way we speak. And what I want to draw around this verse is, or what I want to draw out of this verse is actually what is around it. So because it's so long, I won't do what I did with the first two chapters where I read the whole chapter all the way through. What I'll do is I'll read this verse and then I'll pull out a couple of others and we'll talk about what this means and kind of what this means for the genre of poetry. So verses 22, 23, and 24 are quite a famous verse. So what I'll read those. Chapter Lamentations 3, verses 22 to 24. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. And these are quite hopeful and comforting verses. That phrase, they are new every morning, is the phrase that I mean to be the one that has been pulled out and become part of our every language. But this whole sentiment is comforting. It's nice. We can put it up on a picture with flowers behind it and hang it on our wall. But what comes before it is very much not like that. What comes before it is a lament from a first-person perspective. In Hebrew, it's male, but there's sort of this first perspective, and it has been likened by some commentators to that of Job when he is crying out to God in anger. And you have things like, this is speaking about God from the perspective of a person, perhaps someone in exile, or maybe if the author is Jeremiah himself. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away and broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me sit in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. There are a couple of verses that really stick out to me. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, gone is my glory and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. All of the verses leading up to those first ones that we read, those kind of happy verses of hope that God's mercies are new every morning, is the deepest, darkest feelings of despair. The author of Lamentations 3 and these poetic verses in the exile is feeling so depressed and angry and frustrated that they say, I have forgotten what happiness is. The verses after they are new every morning, great is your faithfulness, is somewhat hopeful, but it's also quite vindictive and angry call for retribution, calling on God to take over the enemies, to come down and swallow them up, especially the very end. It says, "Pay them back for their deeds, O Lord, according to the work of their hands. Give them anguish of heart. Your curse be on them. Pursue them in anger and destroy them from under the Lord's heavens." So the couple of themes in this chapter that are consistent throughout all of Lamentations is the idea that both the good and the bad come from God. So the idea that the exile, the anguish, the torment, the destruction that has come upon the people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem is from God. It is part of God's plan, God's punishment for them, whatever you want to say. That's how they understood it. They understood it as being from God, but they also understood God as the one who would come and rescue them, the one who would also make things right. So in their understanding, the understanding of the poetic verses here, God is in control of everything. And in some ways, this is a way to make sense of the world and of life. The idea, if you're going to lean into God being in control, you might as well lean in all the way. For many of us now, and especially those in our church, if you've heard Alistair and I talk, we don't necessarily ascribe to the idea that the bad things in life are caused by God. We would talk about things more in the world happening in ways that that just happen because of the way the world is, and that God is not a kind of puppet master is the term I've used before. God is not up there, pushing all the buttons, controlling every little thing that happens on earth, but God has created this earth, and then it exists, and human beings act, and nature acts, and things happen without God necessarily, being the grand puppet master, making it all happen. But for the author of Lamentations, and for much of the Old Testament, they did kind of understand God in those terms, but they also understood God as the rescuer, the savior, the one who would come and destroy their enemies ultimately. So on the first side of this nice verse about God's mercies never coming to an end and being new every morning is deep, dark, frustrated anguish. And the second half is a hopeful kind of perspective, looking for God, waiting for God, but also an almost sadistic vindictiveness, expecting God to come and act on their behalf. What I want us to take away from this chapter here in Lamentations, which is really interesting, it shows us a lot, is a reminder of how we read poetry in the Bible. We have to understand who's writing it, when they're writing it. This is written by ancient Hebrew authors in the 500s BC, many 2,500 years before we came around. So it's a different culture, it's a different time, it's written in a different language. It's not meant to be literal. It's not meant to necessarily give us a sort of step-by-step process of understanding God theologically. It's a poetic expression of feeling, how these people were feeling in this moment and how they were understanding the world around them and the events that were unfolding around them. And for the author of Lamentations 3 here, they are looking around at the present circumstances of the exile, Jerusalem destroyed, the temple destroyed, most of the people taken away as slaves to Babylon, their children murdered in front of them. The only people left are the ones that the Babylonians didn't see necessarily as useful slaves to them. Their whole world has crashed around them. The idea that they were the chosen people of God, protected by God, living their lives in this process of temple worship and sacrifice and law abiding. All of that comes crashing down and seems hopeless. They have forgotten what happiness is. Yet they still somehow cling to some sense of hope, but it is not a hope that is a visible light at the end of the tunnel. It's a frustrated and blind hope. And so what I want us to take away from this chapter is that there is scope in our experience and in our relationship with God and in the way that our day-to-day lives come face to face with God, there is scope for everything that we feel. There is scope for our intense, deep, dark, depressed frustration and anguish. And there is also space for a hope, and there is space even for somewhat misguided, vindictive anger. But God takes it all and holds it all together. And there is space for that in the way that we interact with God. We do not have to confine ourselves to a sort of set list of pre-approved emotional feelings or states. We don't have to try and do that to ourselves. We are allowed to feel real feelings because humans have, even humans 2,500 years ago, have been feeling a whole range and spectrum of human emotions. And so do not be afraid or do not feel like, as you go about your day-to-day life interacting with God, that the emotions you're feeling are somehow wrong or bad or invalid because you should be feeling X, Y, or Z. You should be feeling hopeful or happy or joyful or, any of those things. You don't have to feel anything. There is scope for everything that you feel in your walk with God. So that's what we will take away from Lamentations 3 and the intense frustration of the beginning and the hopeful vindictiveness of the end. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. That isn't just some ethereal, flowery sentiment. It is a sentiment rooted in deep and real and authentic human emotion. Thanks for joining us this evening. Have a great week.